My last semester at a certain college I was assaulted by a football player for walking where he was trying to drive. Note he was 325 pounds, I was 120 pounds, while unconscious on the ground I lived a different life. I met a wonderful young lady, she made my heart skip and my face red. I pursued her for months and dispatched a few jerk boyfriends before I finally won her over. After 2 years we got married and almost immediately she bore me a daughter. I had a great job and my wife didn't have to work outside of the house. When my daughter was 2 my wife bore me a son. My son was the joy of my life. I would walk into his room every morning before I left for work and doted on him and my daughter. One day while sitting on the couch I noticed that the perspective of the lamp was odd, like inverted. It was still in 3D but, just wrong. It was a square lamp base, red with gold trim on 4 legs and a white square shade. I was transfixed, I couldn't look away from it. I stayed up all night staring at it. The next morning I didn't go to work, something was just not right about that lamp. I stopped eating, I left the couch only to use the bathroom at first, soon I stopped that too as I wasn't eating or drinking. I stared at the freaking lamp for 3 days before my wife got really worried. She had someone come and try to talk to me. By this time my cognizance was breaking up and my wife was freaking out. She took the kids to her mother's house just before I had my epiphany. The lamp is not real. The house is not real, my wife, my kids, none of that is real. The last 10 years of my life are not freaking real. The lamp started to grow wider and deeper, it was still inverted dimensions, it took up my entire perspective and all I could see was red. I heard voices, screams, all kinds of weird noises and I became aware of pain. A fucking shit ton of pain. The first words I said were, "I'm missing teeth," and opened my eyes. I was laying on my back on the sidewalk surrounded by people that I didn't know, lots were freaking out, I was completely confused. At some point a cop scooped me up, dragged/walked me across the sidewalk and grass and threw me face down in the back of a cop car. I was still confused. I was taken to the hospital by the cop, seems he didn't want to wait for the ambulance to arrive, and give CT scans and shit. I went through about 3 years of horrid depression. I was grieving the loss of my wife and children and dealing with the knowledge that they never existed. I was scared that I was going insane as I would cry myself to sleep hoping I would see her in my dreams. I never have, but sometimes I see my son, usually just a glimpse out of my peripheral vision. He is perpetually 5 years old and I can never hear what he says.
This will probably get buried. When I was around 20, a few years ago, I kept having dreams about a woman with long black hair named Aurora, pronounced Aurora. They were different dreams but for some reason, her distinct face and name always ended up in them. It got to the point where I would wake up frustrated and confused, trying to Google her name or find out how I was connected to her. After a few months she stopped showing up and I dismissed it, thinking my brain was just being stupid. Fast forward a few years later, Halloween 2009, I'm in the car with a friend stopped at a gas station. I'm about to pull out and merge onto a highway when I get a phone call from a random number, so I stopped the car but no one answered. There was a person behind me who grew impatient, honked at me, and then swerved in front of me instead of waiting for 2 seconds for me to move. Second they get on the highway, some silver Civic loses control of their wheel and crashes into the car that swerved in front of me. I called the cops and waited at the gas station for them to come. Turns out the drivers of both cars died. It 100% would have been me if I hadn't have got that phone call. Called it back a few hours later out of gratitude and curiosity, rang 3 times and went to voicemail. "Hi, you've reached Aurora, please leave your name and number." Never had goosebumps like that in me life. Called it again the next day, because I was that confused about the whole situation. Some woman answers, we get to talking, I tell her my entire story including the dreams I had. She tells me she doesn't know how I got her number, and that she never called me as far as she remembers. Weird. Ask her if she has a Facebook to confirm if she is in fact the woman in my dreams. Check her Facebook, holy fuck, it's her. If that's not a glitch in the Matrix, then I'm just batshit crazy.
My dad had this little toy monkey that he used to call his favorite child and tease me and my siblings with it, not in a bad way, but it was really frustrating to us and we spent hours trying to steal it from him. Well, anyways, one day we finally got it and threw it into the garbage after drawing on it and mangling it for a bit. My dad laughed and searched for it a bit but basically figured we had thrown it out and gave up after a few days. Anyways, a few years later, when I was about 17, I'm walking down the street in Toronto. I don't live there, was just visiting friends, and I see this little orange object on the side of the road. When I walk over to it, I pick it up and see that it was the exact same freaking monkey. It even had the black Sharpie lines on it from when we drew all over it. I honestly cannot even come up with the chances of that happening, especially considering our garbage is sent to a local dump and is nowhere near Toronto. I actually took it with me and burned it with fire just so I knew it wouldn't come back again. Growing up, my parents always had white washers and dryers. Always, they never got new ones. They're just the basic ones, the top loaders. Sometime maybe a couple of months or maybe a year ago I came home and my parents had red washing machines. They're side loaders and they looked brand new. I asked my mom when they got these, she looked at me confused and said they've had these for years. She was very adamant about it and confused that I didn't know that these have always been there since they bought the house. I told her I remember the white ones. And she kept saying that we never had white washers or dryers. These are the ones we've always had. Well, I dropped it but was confused. Like, how did I not remember the washer and dryer I grew up with? Mind you, I moved into that house when I was 10. Moved out when I was 19. And I'm almost 25 now. Okay, fast forward to today. I drove to my parents' house, which is about a 3-hour drive. I needed to pick up my birth certificate. So I'm talking with my mom and then I started looking around the house because I like to see what has changed. The last time I was there was when the red washer and dryer thing happened. I went into the laundry room and saw the white washer and dryer that I remember having growing up. I asked my mom what happened to the red washer and dryer. She said, "We had this conversation the last time. I've never had a red washer or dryer. These are the same ones from when we got the house." I'm so confused. I was catching a train in one particular city about 15 minutes from where I get off. While I wait, there is a woman with glazed eyes asking people for money. She came up to me, stopped briefly, and asked, "Excuse me, could you spare some money? My brother is in the hospital and I'd like some money to buy him some flowers." That's bold, I thought. Drug addicts are getting more and more obvious with their lines. "Here's $5. Gave it to her without even looking her in the face, convinced of her intentions. Anyways, my train pulls up and I get on. I look through the glass at her walking around asking others for money as the train pulls away. The train arrives at the station 15 minutes later, and I walk down and out to the bus stop. There is only one bus the direction I'm going, and just my luck, it is there waiting when I get off the train. So on the bus I hop and wait for the bus driver to finish reading his paper before the doors close and we embark down the highway. About 5 to 10 minutes traveling, the driver pulls over for a routine stop. The doors open, and to my complete astonishment the woman from the train walks into the bus. A dozen roses in hand. She looks me right in the eyes as she walks past to take her seat. How in the blue hell did she get there? I took the train before her. I watched her at the train stop from inside as we pulled away. I went over a river. I caught the first and only bus going this particular direction. And not only did she beat me there, she had time to go to a store and buy a dozen roses. To this day I have no idea how this happened. When I was like 10 or 11 I was going to the beach with my aunt and her friends. There were 2 cars of us. To get there we had to go through a very large industrial area. We didn't know the direction, so our car was following the other. Suddenly, they did an unexpected turn and so our driver had to take a sharp bend. In that moment we heard a very clear loud voice inside the car saying laughing, "Sharp bend, hey?" The driver immediately hit the brakes. We looked at each other, puzzled. We all recognized it as a voice not belonging to any of us. In the very same time, we noticed that the other car has stopped as well. The other driver got out of the car with a scared face and shouted to us, Did you hear that as well?" They heard the very same thing inside their car. The area around was full deserted. Edit. Thanks for the interest. A little bit of background, this happened in central Italy in the early 90s. My aunt used to act at the time and most of the other guys were theater actors. The voice scared the shoot out of us because it was very clear, near, but not coming from a direction within the car you could distinguish, nor front, nor rear. Inside the car but from no distinct place. It was like mocking us. We were scared, but soon someone started to say, "Hey, who of you did?" Remember, those were comedy actors used to do any sort of strange voice. This, till we noticed the other car stopping and saw the look of the guy driving that car. They all were as scared as us and told us, "We heard this scary voice inside our car," and told the very same words we just heard. We were there, in a hot day, under the sun in an area with large streets and absolutely nothing and no one around us, no cars, no people, no buildings. We never figured out what happened. When I was a teenager I had 2 really intense dreams one night. The first one was about an online friend of mine calling me to say she'd broken up with her boyfriend, and I sang a few lines of Seal's "Don't Cry" to her over the phone. The second dream was finding a real-life friend dead body floating in her bathtub. I didn't think anything of it up until I logged online that evening and the online friend came online to tell me her boyfriend broke up with her. I immediately asked if I could call her, and she said no. I remember thinking that it meant something, like I could change it. Not long after, my phone rang, and it was real-life friend from the dream calling me. I was completely freaked at this point, but talked to her normally. She was just talking about school and stuff, up until I realized I heard a splash in the background. I asked her, "Are you in the tub?" and when she said yes I felt like my heart had stopped. I asked her, "What did you do?" She didn't answer me right away, and then after a very long pause she told me she'd taken an entire bottle of pills and chased it with mushrooms and vodka. She'd gotten scared waiting for it to hit her, so she called me so she'd hear someone's voice. I hung up and called 911. By the time they got there she was unconscious, but alive. Today she's a mom to a beautiful little girl, and she's okay. I was heading home with my dad. We stopped at a drive-thru. I start feeling more and more anxious for no reason, to the point where it makes me lightheaded and sick to my stomach. We have to wait a little bit ahead, because they gave us the order wrong. So I sit there, feeling really bad, and it suddenly comes to me an urge to call my brother. He was trying to call us. He was in a car accident. No one died, some got seriously bruised, he was only shaken. I told him to shut up and get as far away from the car as possible. He didn't understand but followed through, trying to call some of his buddies, and I could hear them calling him a wuss. him giving up and getting far, and then a loud noise, people shouting. After the whole thing was over, he told me what happened. His drunk friend tried to impress some girls in the car, hit the gas, drifted and hit the bottom of the car on some rocks, completely messing with the engine. They stood near the car, the driver still inside trying to turn the engine back on. The hood burst in flames and the car started to burn fast. The driver managed to get away, but got severely hurt. Some of the guys and girls who stood around were hurt and burned too, but not as bad as the driver. My brother was the only one with light bruises from the whole thing. He told me that when I ordered him to get away from the car, he was in front of it, inches from the hood. I never experienced anything like this before and after, just this once. It's just a fucking weird memory. I don't remember what I was thinking. I remember it like watching a movie and seeing myself and everything from an outside angle. I am from Finland, and that's also where these things I'm about to describe to you happened. This was some years ago, pre-smartphone/GPS era. It was the end of the summer and myself and two friends were on a camping trip way up in the north, in Lapland. The mosquito season was over, and the weather was cooling down in anticipation of the coming fall. The three of us had packed food and gear for a 10-day trek. The car we arrived in had been left at the parking lot of a visitor center. This happened within the premises of the Urho Kekkonen National Park, a 985 square mile stretch of wilderness near the Russian border. The terrain there varies greatly, from treeless and semi-mountainous to dense forest of spruce and pine and dwarf birch. There are lots of swamps. Seeing reindeer is not uncommon, and some nights you might hear wolves in the distance. You can run into a bear or a wolverine in this place, but of course normally they avoid people. We mostly camped in a tent, but some nights we used shelters and simple huts provided for travelers free of charge. The trip had lasted 5 days. We were at the furthest of any kind of civilization we were going to be on that particular outing, truly in the middle of nowhere. There really is nothing there. There are no villages, towns or industry. The place is a national park after all. Seeing other hikers happen from time to time. You'd see some people in the distance maybe, very rarely would you come face to face with anyone. So, in the middle of our trip, we were camped in a small clearing, woodland extending around us for a considerable distance in all directions. It was already dark, we had eaten our evening meal and all three of us were jammed in our only tent. It was a bit cramped, but we fit. We took turns carrying it during the hikes. We were just exchanging some jokes and crude humor in the dark, like guys in their 20s do, about to go to sleep in our sleeping bags. When we quieted down, we began to hear it, talking. And the sound of machinery. Given our location, this was profoundly weird. We camped in a tent because there were no huts nearby. Maybe there was another camp somewhere near us. We couldn't quite make out what was being said, but it was a human voice, no doubt about it. But nothing really could explain the sound of heavy machinery. It sounded like an excavator or a tank, something big, powerful, and really not too far away. Combined with the sound of talking, we thought, construction yard. But at that time of night, in an unpopulated, protected nature reserve, we got out of our tent. It was cold and pitch black. The campfire had some coals still glowing. We took out our flashlights. My two buddies have always been a lot braver than me. The sound was clearly coming from the north, maybe half a kilometer away. We thought the construction might be going on behind a small hill some distance away. We could see no lights or anything. We still could not make out what was being said. The speaking-like voice was monotonous, and it was impossible even to say what language was being used. Still sounded a lot like a person speaking though. You may be aware of the sort of spooky phenomenon of hearing a human voice in static. Maybe you've used a blow dryer and been sure someone is talking, turn it off and it was just something the brain tried to interpret from the steady hum. Maybe it was sort of like that, it's hard to explain. The machinery-like sound continued, not loud, but you could sort of make out the powerful engine, at times accelerating/adding power, at times at idle. My two friends resolved to go find out what was going on. We put our warm clothes back on, donned boots, and I sat next to the dying fire, adding some more wood to it. I would stay at camp while my buddies left to check out this mystery construction yard in the middle of nowhere in the Lapland woods. So, there I sat. The guys took out their maps, took a compass heading and left, and I could hear them make their way through the forest, see the light from their flashlights. Then they were gone. The weird sounds continued, unaltered. They were gone 15 minutes, then maybe 30. Then the better part of an hour. It was odd, judging by the volume of the sound, they should have reached it, checked it out and been back already. I added more firewood, and tried to make out what the person talking was saying, but it was too tinny and obscure. The guys had been away for over 2 hours. I figured they had stayed for coffee with the construction guys or something. Then the sound stopped. Just like that. It just ended, all at the same time. The engine sound and the voice both just quit. It was very silent. I waited for another 30 minutes, very worried now that something had happened, that maybe my friends were lost. Should I go and try to find them? I shouted their names several times, and built the fire pretty big. I was scared shitless when suddenly I saw the flashlights of my friends. Apparently they were returning in a hurry. The guys got back to camp, out of breath. They told me the following: they had followed the sound beyond the small ridge in the distance. There was nothing there, and it seemed like they were not getting any closer to the source of the sounds. They had to stop every now and then, be quiet and listen to it to be able to walk towards it. They walked and stopped like this for some time, then realized they were not getting any closer. The sounds did not change in volume at all. They decided to go just a bit further, several times, when suddenly the sound just stopped, like someone pressed a button on a recording. They realized they had been going on for a long time. They were in the middle of the dark woods, alone. They reversed the heading and started back at a brisk pace. Eventually they saw my big-ass fire from the top of a hill and found their way back. The weird thing is, we seem to think the sound stopped at different times. They had been gone 5 hours in total. They said the sound stopped at around the 1 hour 15 minutes mark after they left. They then started to head back immediately, return trip taking a bit longer. Even though they kept a good pace, they apparently wandered around a bit. For me, the sound stopped at the 2-hour mark, just 30 minutes before they returned. We did not sleep that night. Nothing more happened on that trip, and we never found out what the weird construction yard-like sound was about. When we returned to the park's visitor center some 5 days later, we asked around, but no one knew of any ongoing construction taking place in the whole national park area. Been bugging me ever since. This happened when I was 11. I still remember it like it was yesterday. My grandfather was getting old and had been in and out of the hospital a few times that year. At that moment he had been in the hospital for probably 2 days. We had gone into the hospital to visit him, where I gave him a big hug and told him I loved him and would see him tomorrow. That night, I went to bed, and had the most beautiful dream. My grandpa came into my room and sat in the rocking chair in the corner. He invited me into his lap and told me he was going away for a while and that someday he would see me again. I shouldn't worry, because everything was okay and he wasn't in any pain. I smiled at him and gave him a big hug and told him I understood. I then looked over at my brother sleeping in the bunk below me and asked my grandpa if we should wake him up and tell him. When I turned back around to get a response from my grandpa, he was gone. I ran to the window to look out onto the front yard. There he was waving at me. He whispered, "Go tell your mom and dad exactly what I told you." I looked back at the door to my room and then back at the front yard, and he was gone. I immediately woke up, ran to my parents' room and turned on the light. I told them exactly what Grandpa had told me. They told me it was just a dream and to go back to bed. I told them again exactly what Grandpa told me. Again, frustrated, it was 2 a.m., told me to go to bed and we would talk about it in the morning. Just then the phone rang. It was the hospital. My mother started sobbing. Grandpa had passed. At that moment she just sat there with my father staring at me. I still remember their faces. They both looked at each other, then me, then each other, and finally smiled and stopped crying. They gave me a big hug and told me they loved and to go back to bed. They ended up going to the hospital that night and my aunt came over to watch us. But we have never talked about that night since. In fact, I don't think I have ever written about it, which explains the tears rolling down my cheeks right now. Wow, that was liberating. And I am glad other people have had these types of things happen. It happened in early 2000 when I was working at a juvenile detention center in a small town in Oklahoma as a corrections officer. I was working nights at the time and went to work at 9 p.m. This one night when I arrived for work, my supervisor looked confused and asked me what I was doing there. I said, "I work tonight." And he said, "But they said you called in a few hours ago saying that you were sick." I was a bit confused and said, "It must have been someone else and they got the message wrong." After everyone else showed up for work that night, it was a bit more weird, but we carried on as usual and assigned everyone their places for the night. I went to work in the control room where I usually work. The control room is the center of the prison that has direct control over the cameras, doors, phones and everything. After I relieved the guard on duty and settled in for the night, I looked at the message that said I called in. It said that I had called at 6:50 and said that I had gotten sick while out cleaning up after the storm. There had been a storm the night before and it was a bit bad, but not anything that I had to go out to clean up. It was truly weird. The supervisor came into the control about that time. He was also a friend of mine outside work and we started talking about it, and how odd it was. I decided to call my wife at home and tell her about it while he was still sitting there. I picked up the phone and dialed. After 2 rings, a man picked up the phone and with a raspy voice said, "Hello?" I did not know what to say for a few seconds. I looked at the phone to make sure I dialed the right number, and I had. After a few seconds the person said, "Hello," again in the same raspy voice. I said, "Hello. Who is this?" "This is Taylor." "Who is this?" the person said. My head started spinning because my name is Taylor also. I said in almost a scream, "Where is Anne?" He said, "Anne's in bed." "Who is this?" I dropped the phone and told my supervisor to ring me out. I had to get home, and I took off towards the door. I could hear Dave pick up the phone behind me and say, "Hello," followed soon after by, "What the fuck," rather loudly. I ran to my car and drove home faster than what was legal, my mind racing the entire time. I busted through the door and my wife was sitting watching TV and was shocked at me being home. I asked her who was there and she said no one has been here. After a rather long talk with my wife, I went to call the prison to tell them what was going on, but the phone was dead. I went back to work and when I came in, Dave was acting weird and asked me, "How the hell are you doing this?" He told me that when I left, he picked up the phone and the person on the other end sounded like me. He kinda freaked out and hung up the phone. A minute later, as he could see my car leaving the parking lot, I had called back from home and asked what the fuck was going on. He said that I was a bit irate and said I was sick and did not feel like playing these games and was telling him to stop prank calling me and hung up. After convincing him I had no idea what was going on, we went back to work. Later, I find out that the phone line for my area had been knocked down the night before by the storm. This is absolutely the strangest thing that has ever happened to me.